This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
It's a television series on cable that was adapted from a novel. Wouldn't necessarily recommend this for Christian viewers, but it's instructive in one sense, in that when groups of people move from one place to another, they take the gods that they've worshipped with them. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me tonight for a conversation that'll be a little different from the ones we've had in the past, but is very timely in that we normally have these conversations during the month of October as we head into the season that is arguably the most popular holiday in modern America, sadly enough, and that, of course, is Halloween. He is the founder and director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology and the author of a number of books, including, most famously, Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim. He is our friendly neighborhood PhD. We welcome back to the program Dr. Judd Burton. Judd, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
This is a topic you suggested. I'm glad you did, because this is something Sharon and I have speculated about somewhat, and she's writing some of this into her Red Wing Saga series of supernatural fiction. But that is the idea that not only are there spirits of place, we see hints of that in the Bible, in the book of Daniel, where the prince of Persia has to be subdued by the archangel Michael in order to allow a messenger to deliver a message to Daniel. But then he's told that the prince of Greece would eventually come and confront the prince of Persia. It's clear in the context that we're dealing with supernatural entities. When people move from one place to another, they would take the worship of their gods with them. And we've been doing research on this. Your recent paper on the origin of the phonemes, the bits of language used to describe royalty, and especially supernatural rulers, the root word behind words like Rex and Roy and Regal and Royal and Rephaim, and tracing it back to the area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, which is not coincidentally the area below the mountains of Ararat, where the Ark came to rest. When the people spread out from there, going to Sumer, going to the rest of the Fertile Crescent, spreading north into Asia, and from there into Europe and east to Asia, they carried the knowledge of these old gods with them. We here in the United States, and many of the countries in Europe as well, over the last 10 years or so, since the beginning of the Syrian civil war, especially. But here, just within the last couple of months in the United States, in your state of Texas, you're dealing with an influx of migrants who, I don't want to get into the political aspect of this, but has anyone there asked how tens of thousands of people managed to walk from Haiti to Texas?
Well, no, I mean, that's the thing is these people who are, supposed to be impoverished, where do the resources come for them to cross the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, get into Mexico, make it through Mexico? And some of them, from what I understand, have been waiting for 2 or 3 years for this to happen. And supposedly it coincides with Biden's suggestion that they rush the border, once he's president. Mm-hmm. So there's, like you say, we don't want to delve too deeply into the political, but there's definitely something transnational that's going on. Well,
and the spiritual aspect is the thing that we as Christians ought to focus on anyway, because the politics have changed all over the world over the last 2,000 years, and whether under kings or emperors or dictators, the gospel message has gone forth, and we in 21st century America start getting irritated when there's pushback when we say Merry Christmas or what have you. We really don't know from persecution. So we need to focus on the job, which is making disciples of all nations, because these people coming across the border, Christ died for them too.
Absolutely. And
coming from Haiti, I'm not intimately familiar with the religion there, Voodoo, but I do know that it's a kind of a mashup of Roman Catholicism and some of the religions from Africa, Yoruba in particular, that involve veneration of the dead, veneration of the spirits, and this is something that you and I can both trace back. You've been researching the Nephilim and the Rephaim for a lot longer than I have, but we both have really been focused on that in recent years, so we can trace that back to the ancient Amorites, go back 4,000 or 5,000 years. How is this affecting this mass movement of people, many of whom may be subject to those spirits that are venerated in voodoo coming across the border?
Yeah, well, as you point out, Christ died for these people too, and we don't wish them harm in any way, shape, or form. But one of the things that I hear, or that I don't hear, you don't see articles, you don't hear commentary on the sort of supernatural contraband that these people could potentially be, carrying over, and in the form of the religion of voodoo or Vodou, which, as you point out, is a syncretistic religion. It fuses West African religions that were brought over during the slave trade amongst people like the Yoruba, the people from the Congo, from all over the West Coast, down as far south as Angola even. You find a very similar worldview in the spirits and deities that were worshipped by these peoples, and they were syncretized with the Roman Catholic saints, because Haiti begins as a colony called Saint Domingue under the French. It was the western side of the island of Hispaniola, and it didn't take long for that syncretism to take place, the diffusion of those religious ideas and then their syncretism. But you find variations of this all throughout the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Santeria is very similar in Latin America. The curanderismo amongst people of Mexican descent is also very common. There are variants of this in Jamaica and Cuba. There's candomblé in Brazil and on the north coast of South America. So it's a very similar religious practice that rests on a theology based on these West African gods, or Loas, and at the heart of it is spirit possession. In other words, most of their rituals, including the very early initiatory rituals, and that's another thing, technically this is a mystery religion because you have to be initiated into it, even though it's a point of national pride for many Haitians. It is a mystery religion that you have to be initiated into. But from the simplest initiation into the most complex sorts of rituals performed by their own god, the Hogans or Hogans, the priest, and the Mambos, the priestesses, they all involve some form of spirit possession. And of the 15,000 and who knows how many other thousands that are on the border right now, not only the Del Rio situation, but now they're making their way to the lower Rio Grande. So they're going to be crossing bridges in Starr County and Hidalgo, places like McAllen, Donna, Weslaco, all the way down to Brownsville. You're going to start to see those buildups as well. But nobody seems to be talking about the fact that the spirituality that most of these people are bringing with them is this practice of voodoo, which, again, like a lot of the things that we talk about, whether it's vampires or witches or werewolves or whatever, you have to get past the Bela Lugosi White Zombie movie or The Walking Dead. You have to move past the veneer of the pop culture and literature and cinema and all that to get down to the truth about things like voodoo and probably one of the more popular traditions associated with voodoo, the zombification of individuals.
When these people cross over, and we don't know where they're going, how does this spirituality then affect the places where they were settled?
Well, really, you can go back to the origins of Haitian voodoo during the beginning in the very late 17th century, going throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. There's a period of that syncretism and build-up for a little over 100 years, and it becomes a contributive factor in a number of slave revolts, and in fact the revolution in Haiti, but in the late 1700s and early 1800s under Toussaint Louverture. It was voodoo that was the driving spiritual force behind the political upheaval that eventually caused Haiti to gain its independence. And interestingly enough, the Roman Catholic Church was all but driven out of Haiti in the wake of the Haitian Revolution. And so voodoo was the national religion. It's really not until the late 19th, early 20th century that Roman Catholicism began to have a presence again of any significant bearing in Haiti. And so, at ground zero, essentially, for the nationalization of Haiti, you get a pretty good picture of what political effects or what physical naturalistic effects happen because of this spiritual tradition. Some people will probably remember Francois Duvalier, who was president of Haiti from about 57 to 1971. They're about 72, something like that.
The one they called Papa Doc.
Yeah. And, he was regarded and also perpetuated this image, although by that time Roman Catholicism had reestablished itself in Haiti. He's quoted as saying that voodoo was the key to Haitian unity, and that this had to be an idea that was embraced by all Haitians in order for Haiti to survive. And interestingly enough, as a footnote to that, he would use the hongans, the priest, as his kind of his intelligence agents in the field / secret police during this time. So it was really kind of a grim, political structure, because it all rested on, not just his sort of cult of personality following that he had, but the fact that he actually was a practitioner in all of this. So there are some examples. Now, by proxy, an analogy, you can see how similar belief systems like Santeria, Candomblé, Curanderismo, these other traditions that are very much related, very similar to voodoo, they're entrenched, they're ensconced in the cultures that they end up in. And although you don't always see them playing out in national politics like you do in the case of Haiti, they do sometimes bubble up to the fore, and they're certainly, for many, many people in these regions, they're a part of everyday life. I mean, even in South Texas, when I lived in South Texas, there were Yerberas who were a type of curandera who had shops in the downtown area. So it's even part of that South Texas, northern Mexico culture as well. So there are a few examples of just how influential those traditions can be.
Of course, there are stories of voodoo queens in New Orleans, and maybe that's just because it rhymes. I don't know. But Marie Laveau was supposed to be a very famous practitioner back in New Orleans back in the day.
In fact, she's interred in the Saint Louis cemetery. Now, the way that voodoo got to, and that's probably in America, that may be the the most impacted area that people know about is Louisiana, specifically New Orleans, and kind of by proxy the South, because you have other traditions that sprout off of these slave religions like this, like Hoodoo is very similar to it. You find that in other parts of the South. But there were many people who came from Saint Domingue, again, which is the original name of Haiti, to New Orleans during the 18th century. And so you end up with a lot of that influence, but both slave and there were also free blacks that came from Saint Domingue. Probably anywhere between 5 and 10% of them were free people of color. But yeah, I mean, even to this day, I mean, the influence of voodoo in New Orleans is very clear.
It's got a reputation of being really creepy. There are horror films or supernatural thrillers that involve voodoo, and that's probably given us a twisted impression of what the religion is all about. You mentioned the Loas and the priests of it. What are the basics of the religion? What do the gods do? How do the practitioners, the faithful, appease them or please them? What's the relationship between the adherents of the religion and the gods they serve?
Well, the chief deity at the pinnacle of their pantheon of Loas is Bondier, and it's very much like you would find. I mean, there's a council of gods. You know, it's like you would find anywhere else in any other pagan pantheon, and they're associated with different attributes, often with different aspects of nature. There's a whole, taxonomy of them, just like you find in other polytheistic systems. What's interesting about voodoo is that there doesn't seem to be a fixed ethical code. In other words, there's nothing that's prescriptive per se. Morality and ethics are dictated by situation and context. Okay. So there's this relativism that doesn't really operate on a kind of good-evil dualism that some systems do, which leaves you a lot of gray area to work with in terms of morality for practitioners, which is a dangerous thing. But we also have to remember that Vodou Saints or practitioners of voodoo don't just worship these levels of gods, the Loas, but they also venerate their dead ancestors.
Right.
And this is what always caught my eye. I'm sure you ran across this in your research for veneration, is that they still believe that their dead ancestors are active in human affairs, and that they have to be, just as the Loa have to be. They're often irritable, can get dangerous, so they need to be placated, and they also need to be fed, which I thought was interesting because they're always hungry. And this is starting to line up with the general spirits of the Nephilim, the Rephaim, in terms of their ultimate destiny. And I don't know if you knew this or not, Derek, but they also believe that the spirits of their dead ancestors and their Loas, particularly the Loas, lived underwater.
Oh, really?
They lived at the bottoms of rivers and lakes and in streams and oceans and things like that. And so, when I was in grad school thinking about this, I wasn't really trying to put that together with the Apsu, the watery abyss of Mesopotamian tradition. But it just sort of, particularly as I've been teaching these classes, the preternatural morphology certification has a zombie class. And as I was putting that together and working on that chapter from the Van Helsing way, it just popped. I mean, there's the connection right there. There are definitely other connections to be made with how important spirit possession is in voodoo, but there's the spirits of the Rephaim, spirits of the Nephilim connection. Is this belief in that the Loas lived underneath water?
That is really fascinating, because that is something that connects to the Apsu, the abyss of Sumerian religion, but even earlier than that, which surprised me as I was researching for the book, The Second Coming of Saturn, that the ancient Hurrians, who probably gave the Sumerians the word for the Abzu. It comes from the Hurrian word Abi.
That's right, the ceremonial pits.
Yes, the necromantic ritual pit. But there is a treaty that was found from about the time of the Judges, around 1275 BC is when this was dated. It includes a reference to a Hurrian term that features the divinity symbol, and then the words Kaskal Kur. And listeners may know that Kur in Sumerian is a word that means mountain, but it also means netherworld. Kaskal is a term that means waterway, but it can also mean like a road or like a path. So the idea here is that in this treaty that was found between a Hittite king and a prince of Troy, believe it or not, whose name was Alexander, which is really kind of funny because Alexander of Troy was Paris.
Yeah, exactly. That's Paris's name.
Yeah. This Kaskal Kur was apparently a watercourse or a waterway that led down to the netherworld, sort of like in the same concept, I guess, as the river Styx. It was a water that you had to cross in order to get to the deities on the other side. But at this ancient Hurrian city of Urkesh, which dates back into the 4th millennium BC, there was a drain above this ritual pit, the Abi, which they believe might have represented the Kaskal. Now, they don't have any any engravings that I'm losing nouns here tonight. It's past bedtime.
No, textual evidence.
Any textual evidence, thank you, that at Urkesh that would connect the two, but it appears to fit with the Hurrian text from about 3,000 years later, during the time of, or 2,000 years later, during the time of the Hittites, that points to the same thing. So you've got this idea over and over. In fact, in the book of Job, there's a reference to the shades under the waters, the spirits, the Rephaim under the waters. So we've got this biblical context as well, and this is showing up again in modern voodoo. This is really this is going to have to go in the next book.
Well, that's what we're here for, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, this stuff is fascinating, disturbingly fascinating, but fascinating nonetheless. And that if you dig deep enough, you find that connective tissue. Just like the linguistic work that I started earlier in the year, you dig deep enough, and you're going to run into these connections. And the one you pointed out in the Hurrian context makes even despite the lack of epigraphical or text evidence, it makes perfect cognitive sense. Just in terms of cultural ideation, it makes perfect sense.
And this connects then to the flood of Noah and those entities that walked the earth prior to the flood, who were now confined in the abyss on the other side of these waters.
Yes, and probably the swan diving pigs in the New Testament that Jesus runs the demons into. Yeah.
Especially because, and I made reference to this in the Second Coming of Saturn as well, there's Israeli scholar Baruch Margalit, who, in analyzing one of the texts from Ugarit, argued that the double deeps, which were the abode of El, might actually point to not the waters below Mount Hermon in the Grotto of Pan, but might refer to the Sea of Galilee, which would make that incident with the pigs and the Gadarene demoniac even more eye-opening.
Indeed, and with I say recent, not terribly recent, but the find of settlements on the east side of the Sea of Galilee that had been submerged up until a few years recently. I'm trying to remember you may know about what I'm talking about.
I just saw a reference to this the other day, some archaeological work on the shores on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, but there's some evidence there that there were some settlements. In fact, we heard about this at the International Symposium on Archaeology and the Bible in Albuquerque, work being done at Bethsaida by Ravi Aram of University of Nebraska, Omaha.
Sure.
But he also pointed to some work being done on the east shore of the Sea of Galilee, connected to the ancient kingdom of Geshur, which was ruled at Bethsaida by a couple of guys who had Hurrian names, by the way.
Yeah.
Talmai, the father of Ma'akah, David's wife, the mother of Absalom. He had a Hurrian name, so he may well have come out of this religious milieu. But this also connects to another recent find, only about 10 years ago, on the southwest shore, or actually it's underneath the water, the southwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. There's a giant megalithic monument that was found under the water there.
That's the other one that I had heard about the settlement on the east side, but that was the one I think I was trying to get around to, was the megalithic monument.
Yeah. 60,000 tons of stone, they estimate, in this monument, and that's half again more than at Gilgal Rephaim. I mean, Stonehenge has got 25,000 tons. So this is, 60,000 tons of basalt was piled up in what kind of looks like a big burial cairn of some sort. Mm-hmm. But Dr. Michael Freakman, who was at, I believe, Tel Aviv University, anyway, he has excavated at Gilgal Rephaim, but he just published a paper on that monument under the Sea of Galilee, and connects it to the Ugaritic epic of Akat, which is the story of the young man who gets the magic bow from the craftsman god, and the warrior goddess Anat wants it. He refuses to give it up, and so she has him assassinated. And then the father, whose name is Daniel, goes looking for him and says, when I find him, I'll bury him in a tomb for the underworld gods, which is a reference to the Rephaim. But then he repeats this formula 3 times. When he finally finds his son, he repeats it again. I will mourn for him, and I will bury him in a tomb for the underworld gods at Kinneret, which is the Sea of Galilee. Yeah. So again, perhaps more evidence. So anyway, so this connection between these underworld deities, these spirits, these demons, and water. So what is the deal with them? I mean, how does this influence the religion? Do they practice their rites in water? I mean,
well, no. I mean, not especially. There are some. Now, of course, water and all kinds of things come into play in terms of the actual articulation of ritual, which we could spend 3 hours just talking about. But for purposes of brevity, all kinds of things come into play in terms of ritual. There are all kinds of ritualized objects. In fact, there's a ceremony called baptême, which actually means baptism in Creole French.
Okay.
In which they spiritually baptize an object that they want a Loa, and sometimes an ancestral spirit, but usually a Loa, to inhabit. And so it's not just, there's a spirit possession again, not just the spirit possession of people, which is how they communicate with these things. I mean, it's heavily couched in divination and necromancy, but yeah, there's this. It's actually called baptême, in which they spiritually baptize these usually boxes of some kind, porcelain and clay boxes that are meant to hold the Loa.
Oh. To be then produced later when needed?
To produced but again, it's almost formulaic insofar as that they believe that these deities are constantly in need of placation, and that's how they feed them. various gods like different things. Damballa, the serpent god, likes white foods like eggs. Some of the Loas like cornmeal or flour, wheat meal flour, and some of them are drunkards. Yeah. And they like rum and alcohol, and so there's just a whole host of all of this goes back to these ritual meals that people would have in antiquity and prehistory with their dead ancestors.
Right.
Even today, that's a theme in Dia de los Muertos and in the Celtic Germanic context, Halloween, of course, itself, Samhain. You mentioned Caesarea Philippi at Paneas. There's a whole level of debitage within the cave that was recovered by archaeologists that was strictly made by these busted up pieces of votive offerings. Well, people were bringing in food, casseroles and roasted meats and animal sacrifices and milk and wine and everything you can imagine.
So what you got to pitch in,
off, and so
it's a pitch in, but in a very real sense, you're actually pitching the the casserole into the pit.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why I say this meal with the dead ceremony goes back to arguably even not just antiquity, the stuff that we have text for, but the stuff that we actually have to interpret out of the context of the archaeological record in places like the Natufian levels of Jericho. The Natufians practice a cult of the dead as well. The people that built Göbekli Tepe and Tel Caramel in Syria, it's just peppered all throughout there in the prehistory and the early antique history of the ancient Near East. And again, it's a perennial feature. You find it in cultures all over the world. It's the same thing.
That's the thing that really blew our minds when we researched veneration, and we learned that this was. It's first attested in the text records with the Amorites during the Ur-3 period, which is the third dynasty of Ur, so around 21st century BC, maybe a little earlier, but those were the records were found was at Ur, and there was apparently there were three things that were required for this ritual. Number one was the communal meal. You call the family together. Number two was you say their names, where you have to call the names of the ancestors to summon them to the meal, and then you pour out a ritual drink offering, the oblation, the libation is the word I mean, libation. And that practice continued through 2,000 years of Mesopotamian history. We found, thanks to a scholar who's done excavation and archaeology at Rome, that when the first Christian churches were built at Rome, the early church had continued this practice of the ritual meals around the graves of their ancestors. So they built St. Peter's Basilica, which is on the grounds of the Vatican, was built in the middle of a cemetery so they could facilitate continuing this practice. But it continues to this day. In fact, in some contexts, which would really surprise people. I mean, some of these social justice protests, and I don't want to turn this into a political thing again, but when they're out there shouting, say the name, and then Ashe, which is a term from the Yoruba religion, it doesn't mean really amen. It means it's almost like abracadabra, may it be so.
Yeah, may it be so.
So this is a practice that stretches back the Natufian culture and Göbekli Tepe, we're talking going back 12,000 years.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
It's astonishing that here we are in the 21st century, the technologically advanced era where there are people, very wealthy, educated people who are seriously trying to find ways to defeat death with technology. And yet, in cultures as different as modern day South Korea and Madagascar, you've still got people who are trying to appease and venerate the dead. And again, we've got, untold numbers crossing the southern border because, as I mentioned on SkyWatchTV on Friday, even though they had reduced the number of people underneath the international bridge at Del Rio from 16,000 down to about 3,000 by that point, there were at least 3,000. I think 3,400 was the number that were unaccounted for. We've sent this many back to Haiti. We know this many people are still in custody. This many have been sent to processing centers. Yeah, that leaves 3,400 unaccounted for. Where are they? What are they doing? What communities are they going to? So where are these practices? They're being seeded into communities here in the United States. And as you pointed out, this is a really good point, because we've seen also some very horrible stories in the past couple of weeks. A female service member at Fort Bliss assaulted by a group of Afghan refugees, ostensible refugees. Another case at a military base in Wisconsin, where a young man is now been charged with sexually assaulting underage girls. But as presumably Muslims, as I documented in the book Bad Moon Rising, their religion likewise has a sort of a sliding scale of morality depending on who they're dealing with. Mm-hmm. And this is what we're bringing into not just the United States, because Europe has been dealing with this for some years now, since the beginning of the Syrian civil war. Sure.
Well, I mean, it dovetails nicely, that the moral relativism dovetails nicely with what postmodernism has done with the national conscience, essentially, in the United States. I mean, you and I have had that discussion many times about how postmodernism has gutted and infected virtually every institution of our society. And this will be, this could potentially be another negative influence. And we've created the proper environment for those kinds of things to thrive in.
As Christians, and how do we process this? I mean, we can relate the bad news, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone else. One of the things I try not to do on this program, and also on the daily news commentary at SkyWatchTV, is try to be too negative, because that's a very easy trap to fall into, especially with the influence of social media, where the rage gets amplified by the echo chamber that you choose to join. But as Christians, we understand that the God that we serve, capital G God, spoke the universe into existence, saw that all of this was going to happen. We're told in Scripture that he knows the end from the beginning. So how then shall we live? What do we do? Because obviously just sitting and complaining about it or pointing out the problem is not really, if you point out problems without coming up with some sort of solution or recommendation or encouragement, it's nothing but whining. So I don't want to be a whiner. I don't want to be that guy. How do we then process this, and how do we encourage those around us? How do we even perhaps share the gospel with these folks who are entering our communities?
Well, it's like I tell folks, our marching orders haven't changed. We're called to, love these people and befriend them and interact with them. And, one of the good things about, talking with people from polytheistic traditions is that they're already primed and ready to talk about this stuff. In a lot of cases, they want to talk about. I mean, again, Voodoo, Santeria. There's an initiatory element to it, but there are a lot of things that they can talk about, and they will talk to you about it. So that, to me, that's key. Is having those conversations. Starting where the both of you are. Both of you recognize that there's a supernatural reality. Mm-hmm. Having those conversations gives you the opportunity to be a testimony for Christ, and let the Holy Spirit move in and do work for you. And so, it just a sort of a boots on the ground perspective. I think that as Christians, first and foremost, that should be what should be on our minds. Secondarily to that is informing other Christians, and in fact other people, about the realities of voodoo.
You make a really good point there, and this was something that surprised me about the book I Am Not Afraid by Reverend Dr. Robert Bennett. who's a theologian in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. He went to Madagascar. I mentioned Madagascar before, to write his doctoral dissertation on the surprising growth of the Lutheran Church in Madagascar. That changed very quickly when he got there and attended a ceremony. It was, I think, a blessing or a opening of a new church building of some sort. And a woman fell down right in front of him during the opening prayer, which was described as an exorcism of place. And she began screaming, wailing, and foaming at the mouth. And suddenly a group of lay people came over and began performing an exorcism. Being a Western educated man, he was not expecting that, because we've been trained to believe that demonic possession ended at the end of the apostolic age. And so he asked, how often does this happen? Well, this happens all the time. This is why we have these people trained to deal with this situation. But that was why the Lutheran Church made such inroads in Madagascar when Norwegian missionaries went there, he told us, back in the 19th century. They brought the Bible with them, and they converted a witch doctor. Now, their religion there is animistic, where they worship what they think are the ancestors of the spirits of their dead ancestors, who need to be appeased because they can be very angry. And water plays a role in this. Very often, if somebody does not do right by an ancestor, they will be compelled to throw themselves into a river or a lake and nearly drowned. So, but this witch doctor recognized in the confrontations of Jesus and the apostles with the demons, he suddenly recognized, hey, this is what we're dealing with. So I'm going to follow this Jesus, because he clearly has power over these, because these spirits don't have our best interest at heart. They are not friendly. They are not good for us. And he actually surprised the missionaries, as Dr. Bennett tells the story, that because the missionaries didn't really believe in demonic possession, but the witch doctor is like, what are you talking about? It's right here in your book. So that is why the church in Madagascar has made such inroads over the last century. It's because they see that interaction with the spirit realm on a daily basis. It's part of their lives. So you make a really good point. You're talking to people who are already primed, who believe in the spirit realm, probably more than most American Christians.
Yeah, arguably so. And, that's why I say, I mean, just opening up conversation, with these folks is going to be a start. I mean, again, our best exemplar for this stuff is Jesus. He talked to lots of people from lots of different walks of life, all over the place, and that's how the healing begins. In all the Gospels, these are the accounts that are passed along. So you really don't have to look far, for answers to those kinds of questions. I mean, that's why I say our marching orders haven't changed in 2,000 years.
And Paul going to Mars Hill in Athens,
exactly,
and, talking to polytheists there.
Right. Any of the apostles, or missionaries of the early church doing the same thing. They were in a pluralistic setting. They engaged with people that already believed in the supernatural reality of the universe. Somehow or another, we've got to get that back in the church. We've got to eschew the idea that churches are simply places where we go to get, spiritual therapy. I mean, gosh, I'm an old Southern Baptist guy, so I love pecan pie and coffee. I love socials as much as the next guy. But we've gotten so far away from things, and as our mutual friend, Dr. Greg Reed, has pointed out before, we were so busy being vehement and pugilistic at the vanguard that we weren't guarding our flanks, and all this other stuff began to creep into the church, and that we're left with the scenario that we have now. And materialism supernaturalism has always been part of that stuff that's creeped into the church, so that we treat things like demons and exorcism as okay, that happened in the New Testament, or at the least it's a kind of medieval aberration or something like that. But it doesn't really. We can explain all that away with psychology,
right
today. Well,
chemical imbalance or
right,
yeah,
right. And we're not saying that the disease and the demonic are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They certainly weren't in the way that if we're looking at Jesus as our best exemplar, he, and by proxy people in the Second Temple period, they didn't think about disease the way that we did. And if Jesus is thinking like this, then we certainly need to be acknowledging the natural and the supernatural in these kinds of situations. Yeah. And people who are practitioners of voodoo are already involved in their ritual and their ceremonies. There are both ceremonies for healing, and there are both ceremonies for hexing people, essentially. So they're already, there's a dark side to that, of course, but they're already conversant in the idea, and not just the idea itself, but the idea being put into a sort of, pragmatic execution.
The Institute of Biblical Anthropology, you teach students through online learning, distance learning, these sorts of concepts, these sorts of ideas?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the big missions right now is to get people equipped, to think about these things so that when they encounter them. I've got 6 programs right now. And they deal. The flagship program is biblical anthropology, and it deals with history and culture and language and all that kind of thing with the biblical world. And then I have preternatural morphology, which is my Monsters 101 class, which is vampires, werewolves, zombies, and revenants. And so that's the one where you're going to find a lot of the kind of things that we've been talking tonight about. You're going to find that material in those courses. And I've got demonology, mythology. I've added an ancient Near Eastern civilization program, and there's also a Mediterranean civilization program. And I've actually got a deal going this week that I'm going to extend. And if listeners want to take advantage of it, they can. But they can get because we're coming up on that season, we're right at it, where so many ancient cultures believed that they could communicate with their dead ancestor kings at this time of the year, their dead ancestors. I'm offering the preternatural morphology, demonology, and mythology certifications for $150 each, and people also get a copy of Interview with the Giant and Edith Kelly's book on the history of Halloween, which is an excellent resource.
Preternatural morphology, I like that. I'm going to remember that title because that just sounds really cool. What do you do? I'm a preternatural morphologist.
That's right. That's why it's a fancy way of saying I'm a monster hunter or whatever. I've been trying to develop a taxonomy of giantology over the last couple of years, and that was one of the things that occurred to me. Is, well, if I'm venturing into the quantification of supernatural entities, I probably better have a taxonomy attached to all of this. So that's where it came from.
So the website for the Institute of Biblical Anthropology is tioba.org, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes at vftb.net as always. And Judd's main website is burtonbeyond.com. As we're approaching the Halloween season, again, some good news, encouragement for Christians who are listening to this program and thinking, boy, this stuff is really creepy. What would be the good news in all this?
The good news in all of this is that we have the good news, and we should be sharing it with these people. And the good news is that, whatever appellation we want to throw on the times that we're in, Jacob's trouble or whatever. I mean, the prophetic clock is ticking. I think most Christians who are in the know would admit that. But we should not become discouraged by all of the external ephemera, because our hope lies in Jesus Christ. And we take the Bible seriously as a message, and our eternity does not end here on earth. We go on to bigger and better and more glorious things. We're restored to the divine counsel if we embrace Christ, and to me that is an amazing, wonderful reward, adventure that should excite and enliven people.
Yeah,
and give them hope.
When Paul wrote, "Do you not know you will judge angels? We will judge angels." That's astonishing, and you don't hear that often in church.
You don't hear any connection of humans to the divine counsel, but we were actually amongst the ranks, initially, and so what you and I have been doing, what Mike Heiser's been doing, what a lot of us have been researching, a lot of this has just been, coming to the fore in all of our work, and it's exciting. It goes back to Jesus' visit at Caesarea Philippi when he says, I'm going to do away with this old assembly that screwed everything up, and I'm going to restore you, the ecclesia, the assembly, to your proper place. Yeah. Of course, that's echoed in other places, like in James. That do you not know that you're paraphrasing here, but you become sons of God again. And so that the Greek rendering of that harkens back to the Benach Elohim, and all of the divine counsel wonderment, that's associated with it. So there's a lot to be hopeful for. Yes.
It's not just sitting on clouds and playing harps. It's
playing harps.
Yeah, there's a little more to it than that, and it's way cooler. We're going to have jobs, and look forward to it. Praying that we get to work in the archives, because that would just be that would be.
I'm convinced. We're being trained for that right now. I'm convinced.
Dr. Judd Burton, online at burtonbeyond.com. Judd, thanks again for your time tonight, and God bless you, brother.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Judd Burton's website is burtonbeyond.com, and you can find the Institute of Biblical Anthropology online at tioba.org, tioba.org. Take advantage of that. I mean, who wouldn't want a certificate in monsterology? Huh? Coming up, is China about to hit an economic brick wall, and what does it mean for the rest of the world? That's ahead on A View from the Bunker. Where were you on 10/13? As the Middle East erupts in chaos, a devastating wave of terror shocks the nation. Thousands lie dead. An apocalyptic Christian cult is blamed. And suddenly, believers disappear as internment camps spring up almost overnight. Meanwhile, a deadly virus spreads. A desperate country demands answers, and only a few dare ask, what's in the vaccine? FBI Special Agent Joe Eunice follows a trail of evidence to a small town in Iowa and a young boy who received a mysterious email from God. Now, racing against time, Agent Eunice finds himself working side by side with reclusive internet broadcaster Barney Eisen. Together, they discover a disturbing truth at the center of the conspiracy. They wrestle not against flesh and blood. The God Conspiracy, a novel by Derek P. Gilbert. Get it now in paperback and Kindle from Rose Avenue Fiction. Talking the walk from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker, online at VFTB.net. You can also find us at View from Bunker on Twitter, or just follow my regular Twitter feed at Derek Gilbert. As long as they allow me to stay there, keep kind of treading dangerous territory, things that have gotten other people banned. I just don't have enough followers, I guess, to be much of a threat. You can also find me at Gab, MeWe, Getter, and Parler, Derek P. Gilbert, and all of those sites. And on Facebook, the View from the Bunker page, you'll find it there at View from the bunker. Well, there's been an economic situation, a meltdown brewing inside China for a while that is only now coming to public attention. I've talked about this a few times now on 5 and 10 over the last week or two as Sharon called my attention to it. She gets up before I do in the morning, and she actually trolls through the news and comes up with a lot of stuff. I just wind up, going through her Twitter feed. Yeah, you'll find hers at Sharon K. Gilbert. She tweets out a lot of important news stories in the morning, early in the morning. And so that really, credit where it's due. I'm not joking. She saves me an awful lot of work in going through the news for the SkyWatchTV 5 and 10 update every day. And she pointed to this. And what caught her attention was noticing that the debt liability of a real estate developer in China by the name of Evergrande, 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 is over $300 billion, which is 5 times larger than the debt liabilities of Lehman Brothers when it collapsed 13 years ago and triggered the economic crisis that required bank bailouts and automobile manufacturer bailouts and so forth back in 2008 and 2009. And in fact, the announcement in China that Evergrande was about to miss an interest payment on one of its bonds was 13 years to the day from the Lehman Brothers collapse. Interesting coincidence if you're a coincidence theorist. Anyway, China has been making nice sounds that it's got everything under control. Everything is fine. It's got regional governments calling in armies of accountants and legal experts to examine the finances around those with exposure to Evergrande to contain the fallout from Evergrande's collapse. Now, since that first announcement that it was missing the first payment, it has since missed another one. And so investors around the world are waiting to see what's going to happen because there's a 30-day grace period from the day that it misses the payment and the day that it actually goes into default. So we'll see a couple of these defaults coming up in October if Evergrande can't scrape up the cash to pay off interest payments that are due on bonds that are due to mature at some point in the future. Well, the Chinese government, interestingly enough, when you look at it this way, and I'm looking at an analysis by James Rickards from dailyreckoning.com, and he makes a really good point. What China is doing by saying, oh, this is fine, local governments, armies of accountants, armies of legal experts, it's under control. That's not how the Chinese Communist Party operates. It's centralized control. It's not local government control, which is ostensibly the government that we have here in the United States, at least according to the Constitution, when we choose to follow it. That's not how China works. So if China is saying that the local government authorities are going to contain the Evergrande fallout, the Evergrande collapse, they're lying, because that's not how it's going to happen. The Chinese Communist Party really doesn't care if foreign investors take a bath on this. They really don't. And that's something that foreign investors need to wake up and be aware of. But here in the U.S. and in the U.K., we tend to view everything through a Western lens. So when the Chinese government says it's fine, local governments under control, armies of accountants, armies of legal experts, you heard about the armies of, okay, yeah, it's all fine. They're tending to believe it. But that's not really what's going to happen. The local governments are responsible for keeping the lid on protests because what the CCP does not want are torches and pitchforks. People who have invested heavily in what they thought was a sure path to easy riches, like here in the U.S. Maybe you remember back in the 90s and early 2000s where we were all being encouraged to become day traders. You remember that Super Bowl commercial about a guy who's rushed into the emergency room because he's got money coming out the wazoo? Quick, get that man a private room. That's not how investing works. Not most of the time. But people are willing to buy into it. I mean, if people weren't looking for easy riches, that's, Las Vegas would fold and the state lottery games, the super mega lotto drawings would have nobody buying tickets. Well, a lot of people in China put money into Evergrande, and they're finding out now that they're not going to get their money out for a couple of years. But by that time, Evergrande will be bankrupt, and they'll get nothing. So this could lead to social unrest inside China. And it could lead to a financial crisis that China will not be able to contain within its borders. Again, 5 times larger than the $60 billion debt owed by Lehman Brothers when it collapsed back in 2008. So China, which exists primarily at this point to preserve the regime of the Chinese Communist Party, not for the good of its citizens, is not going to be concerned with how it affects the rest of the world, unless it directly affects the security of the Chinese Communist Party leadership. This is going to be a very interesting fourth quarter, 2021. I mean, just as it looked like things were beginning to normalize a bit with COVID, I mean, we've got college football back, so we've got 30, 50, 70,000 people packing into stadiums on Saturdays here in the United States, while at the same time, our children are still being told they've got to mask up. And in California, they're being told they're going to have to get a COVID vaccine to be allowed back into school. I don't even want to deal with that right at the moment. For many of us, let's put it this way, for many of us, at least here in the Ozarks, where we're in kind of a bubble of liberty, life has more or less returned to normal here in 2021, unless you have to fly somewhere. But as far as going to a restaurant or going into a store, things are somewhat back to normal here. But this Evergrande thing threatens to change reality in a whole nother different way as we head toward the end of 2021 and making 2022 even more interesting. So if you can, and I'm certainly no expert when it comes to dealing with things like this, but if you can, get yourself out of debt. We're already seeing supply chain disruptions here. Costco, week before last, already started putting limits on certain paper products. Yes, we're seeing toilet paper shortages again, even though here in the U.S., the COVID-19 daily new case curve is trending down. But it's because we don't have enough truck drivers. We've got container ships loaded with cargo, just waiting for a chance to be offloaded at the port. We've got even 4 times more cargo ships waiting to be loaded at ports in China. The supply chain disruption caused by COVID has not yet been resolved. So as we head into Christmas, I mean, UK, you've got gasoline stations or petrol stations, I guess, shutting down because they don't have fuel. Empty store shelves. If you can, just stock up on a few extra things and start putting stuff away. Preparedness doesn't have to happen all in one day. Nobody can stock up a preparedness pantry on one paycheck, but you buy a little bit extra every time. Long-term storage stuff. Doesn't have to be freeze-dried food that'll last for 30 years. It can be beans, rice, canned goods that'll last for a while. And paper products, yes. Cleaning supplies, medical supplies. Just put a little bit extra on the shelves every time you make a run to the store. Or if you use Amazon like we do, because we're out here in a rural area where it's actually a lot easier to have stuff delivered to us than it is to run to the nearest Walmart, which is more than half an hour away. Put stuff on Subscribe and Save. Slightly more than you need each month. And just put it on a shelf. Do the best you can, because the extra that you stock may be needed by somebody else that you know. And COVID will fade into the background. It is already on the way down here in the United States, despite the best efforts of our government leaders to try to continue to frighten us. But this China Evergrande thing, I pray that it isn't what it appears to be. Because, again, it's an order of magnitude larger than the Lehman Brothers collapse that caused a global financial crisis 13 years ago. And while China is saying nice things right now, one suspects that it's just to give average investors a sense of security while the smart money heads for the hills. Well, we've got a couple of things ahead that we want you to be aware of. The SkyWatchTV virtual conference, the Defender Conference Countdown, launches just under 2 weeks from now. That's October 15th. This is another virtual conference. Again, thanks to COVID. Couldn't find a convenient hotel here in the area. Now things are pretty much open up, but at the time we would have needed to make the plans. They could not commit. So a virtual conference, 90 days access to a collection of video presentations, and the world premiere of the new documentary film, The Great Delusion, about the UFO and abductee phenomena and what they mean from a Christian perspective. Josh Peck has done a masterful job of putting together this film using footage recorded more than 10 years ago. Yeah, this is about 10 years in the making, and I call it footage. Nobody uses film anymore. Video that was recorded 10 years ago with Chuck Missler, Noah Hutchings, and Chris Putnam, all of whom have been called home and are now with the Lord. But you'll also get Timothy Alberino, Nick Pope, L.A. Marzulli, Tom Horn. Josh is in the film, of course. He was gracious enough to include me because we collaborated on the book published in 2017, The Day the Earth Stands Still, about the spiritual roots, the spiritual forces behind the modern UFO movement. So that will be part of the video collection released on October 15th for you to binge watch on your schedule. Watch what you want in any order you want, as often as you want, for 90 days. So October 15th through January 15th. And you get a $10 discount if you register by October 10th. So register by October 10th for just $85. It goes up to $95 on October 11th. And again, the videos are released to the world at midnight Central Time. That's UTC -5 if you're elsewhere in the world. Midnight Central Time, October 15th, and available for 90 days. Find out more, DefenderConference.com. You'll get a list of all the speakers there. DefenderConference.com. Dr. Judd Burton, one of those, putting together a presentation for the conference, and many others there. Again, you'll see them all there at DefenderConference.com. Now, as far as the SkyWatch TV Tour of Israel, we are still looking forward to March 20th through April 4th being the dates of our tour. And as of this point, we don't have reason to change those dates. We are keeping a close eye on the situation in Israel regarding COVID-19, regarding their travel restrictions and so forth. The great thing about working with Aaron Lipkin and Lipkin Tours is that if the dates change and you can't accommodate the new dates, or if we decide to proceed with the tour and they have rules that you cannot accommodate, like you got to be vaccinated. And I'll say for the record, Sharon and I really, really don't want to get vaccinated unless the Lord makes it clear that in order to do what he wants us to do, unless and until we get a very clear leading from the Lord that we really don't want to take the vaccine. So if that were to happen, you would not be obligated to give up your deposit. You just say, look, I can't, go ahead, enjoy the tour. I'm not going. And Aaron Lipkin will send you your deposit money back. You can find out more, breakdown of costs, sample itinerary, and more. The itinerary is fantastic, and we will see sites that other tours just will not. Shiloh, Bethel, Joshua's Altar, Gilgal, Rephaim, the Stonehenge of the Middle East, and the Serpent Mound of Bashan, among the sites that you want to see, like Jerusalem, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and so on. Joining us are Messianic Rabbi Zev Poret from Tel Aviv and our colleagues from SkyWatch TV, Donna Howell and Ali Henson. And again, you'll find out more online at skywatchinisrael.com. Please bookmark the weekly Bible study that Sharon and I record and upload every Sunday. It's the Gilbert House Fellowship. We just recorded episode number 319 as we're making our way through the Old Testament the second time through. It's usually up and on the web by midday Central Time U.S., and we just go through the Bible verse by verse and exegete as best we can, going through the Bible in chronological order, so in the order of the stories as they're recorded in Scripture. So it's not exactly following the order of the books in the Bible, but we think it's an interesting way to do it because it helps to understand some of the Psalms better, for example, when we get into the life of David and so forth. You'll find all of those episodes online and archived at gilberthouse.org, gilberthouse.org. And our new video program, The Bible's Greatest Mysteries, has launched. Our premiere episode was released to the web on Friday night and broadcast on the PTL network today, Sunday. It is part of a 2-hour block from SkyWatch TV, along with 2 other new programs that launched this weekend as well. Simply His, a women's program featuring Catherine Horn, Nita Horn, Donna Howell, and Ali Henson. It's literally in a coffee shop. The studio is a working coffee shop. and they make an excellent iced caramel macchiato. And it's a unique group because these women, well, let's just put it this way. This is not The View for Christians. This is a women's program featuring intelligent conversation and women who genuinely love each other and enjoy each other's company. So hope you'll enjoy that. And Cherise Parton hosts the other new program called Return to Eden, which is a health-centered program. Her first guest is Joe Horn, talking about his book Time Bomb and his journey to better health. All of those programs now from SkyWatchTV, which, if not a network, is on the verge of becoming a network. Who knows what doors God will open in the future? You can find all of these at skywatchtv.com. The Bible's Greatest Mysteries, available at biblesgreatestmysteries.tv, biblesgreatestmysteries.tv. And hope you enjoy the programs. We've got some great guests lined up, including Timothy Alberino, L.A. Marzulli, Aaron Lipkin, Mike Heiser, and many more in the weeks ahead on the Bible's Greatest Mysteries. Please, thank you for taking time to make time for this podcast. And if you get a spare moment, if you would, leave a review for us at Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever else you find us, which is wherever fine podcasts are sold. You could also give us a like at the View from the Bunker page on Facebook. Our announcer is DC Good, and A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House, released under Creative Commons Attribution, no commercial, no derivatives, 4.0 international license. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.